The Mindful Medic podcast is proudly sponsored by the Medical Benevolent Association of New South Wales, ACT. The MBA is an independent charity that has been supporting doctors in New South Wales and the ACT since 1896. They provide specialised counselling, information, referral and financial assistance to doctors and their families during times of adversity or hardship. Their aim is to provide non-judgmental support so that the doctor or family member recovers their well-being and independence and, wherever possible, returns to their vocation. Their services are free, specialised and no referral is necessary. All contact is kept strictly confidential and they are independent of any regulatory body.
It's just like having that work family, and that, for me, I think that's one of the values that I reflected on while I was doing the yoga teacher training. What do I value? And for me, personal relationships are important, whether it's family or friends. And I want to lead a life where I enjoy the interactions I have with other people. And so doing what I do now allows me to work with people that I like and people who make me feel valued as well. So that's my Santosha.
Hello and welcome back to the podcast. Those were the words and wisdom of today's very special guest, Dr. Yumiko Kadota, who I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast. Dr. Kadota is a medical doctor with experience and training in plastic surgery. She's an anatomy lecturer and teacher of undergraduate medical students in Sydney. She's also a body pump instructor, a yoga teacher, and she most recently added best-selling author to her long list of accomplishments. In March of this year, she released her personal memoir, Emotional Female, which I have spoken about, linked and referenced in the previous 2 episodes of season 2 of the podcast. So you can understand why I'm particularly delighted to welcome her here herself today to speak about her book and to share her story. For those of you who have listened to this podcast since its beginning, we revisit themes that will be familiar to you. We talk about occupational burnout in medicine. We talk about mental health stigma, depression, and suicidality. The book itself addresses more strong but important themes, including bullying, sexual harassment, systemic racism. So before we proceed, I just want to read a message from Yumiko herself, as outlined in the first page of the book. A message from Yumiko. Hello, my name is Yumiko Kadota. I was a doctor. I am a doctor. I am a recovering doctor. This book describes mainly my own experience with mental health issues, racism, misogyny, bullying, and sexual harassment. There are also references to others' experiences with sexual assault, domestic violence, and suicide. As such, please do take care of you when reading this book, especially if any of these themes are triggering for you. If you're in a toxic situation, I hope this book might give you the courage to leave, because you deserve better. Please know that nothing is more important than your physical and mental health. Lastly, I am reclaiming the pejorative term emotional. If you've ever been called that before, I stand by you. Being emotional makes us human, and I'm certain it made me a better doctor to my patients. Keep being emotional. It's a beautiful thing. Lots of love, Yumiko. March 2021. Hello, thank you so much for joining me. I know that you have had an incredibly busy 3 weeks, and here you are. We were talking about setting boundaries, but here you are on holiday, making time to talk to me. So I really appreciate it. And huge congratulations on becoming a best-selling author, #1 in the non-fiction charts at Dymocks. Not that I am surprised.
Thank you, Shez, and thanks for having me on your podcast today.
No, I'm very conscious you've had a busy few weeks with the book launches and all the public speaking events, but I'm really grateful that you're coming to speak to me on this platform, because we have a real opportunity to bring your story and the important messages in the book to a wider audience of our colleagues. So I know we've laid out a bit of an outline for a couple of the things that we want to talk about today. But just before we do that, I wanted to share one of my favourite memories of you. I know that we were colleagues very briefly. I was a registrar in emergency and you were an intern, and we did overlap, I think, briefly through the department, but I actually don't think we had very much clinical interaction with shifts and timing. But I do have a very vivid memory of you. I recall, and I still have the email, one of our consultants sending around an email to say, one of the interns, Yumiko, is entering the world's greatest shave. Could we sponsor her? And of course, we all did, but I was so impressed by this. I think anyone who does the world's greatest shave, I'm impressed by. I know Andrea Johnson at the college just did. And but particularly you had this long, luscious, jet black hair, and to be honest, I had hair envy. And I think your hair was probably longer than I've ever seen it at that point.
It was down to my belly button.
And then you shaved it off and you looked incredible. You utterly rocked it. And I remember thinking, gee, I didn't think she could look any better, but she does. And I share this story because I think it reflects in you a couple of, key attributes which probably set the scene for what comes after and for this story and this conversation. Firstly, an ability to be very vulnerable and have great courage. I think it does take courage to shave off your hair. And kindness and generosity, willingness to do that for others. And I know our clinical paths didn't cross again after that point, but you came to the very forefront of my mind a couple of years ago. And so I think we probably all have moments and times in our life where we can remember, what we were doing, where we were, how we felt when we either witnessed or heard or experienced something. And it's most often, some major political or media event. But I remember where I was and how I felt when I read your now, very famous blog post. And I immediately reached out to you. I didn't really have a contact. And so I suspect that message got lost somewhere in the social media ether. Now reading the book, I realised that several hundred other people reached out to you at the same time. So I wondered if you could take over and start the story from there.
I wrote the blog post about my experience at the last hospital I worked at, where I had my breakdown, because I knew it was something important for me to remember. And I guess the medical side of me was aware that when people go through trauma, they tend to block out certain memories. And I knew that I had to remember everything because it was so transformational. I'd never gone through a low that bad before in my life, and I'd never been that mentally unwell. So I knew that this was something that I needed to remember and to learn from as well. So initially I did it just for me. I was admitted as an inpatient at a psychiatric hospital in October 2018 for 6 weeks. And I knew that I would want to do something while I was in hospital. So I took my laptop with me, set up a blog, and decided to write about all sorts of topics, including yoga as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. And then by December, I thought, you know what, now I'm ready to write about it. For a while, I refused to even think about medicine. It just kind of hurt too much, so I didn't want to write about it. But by December, I was ready to write it. And then in February 2019, so 2 years ago now, I felt like that was the moment that I was ready to talk about it with other people. So I posted it on Facebook just before the start of the clinical year. I think it would have been the Sunday before everyone started the new term.
Yeah.
I knew there would be lots and lots of people starting a new term, feeling all the anxieties I would have felt the year before about needing to please your bosses and get all your references for that year's application. So that's why I chose to do it at that point.
And just to say, I mean, that blog post was entitled "The Ugly Side of Becoming a Surgeon," but the actual kind of blurb at the very top of it was confronting. You are killing yourself for a job that would replace you in a week if you drop dead. Take care of yourself.
I saw that meme somewhere, and I'm just obsessed with memes. My camera roll is pretty much screenshots of memes, but I remember seeing that and going, whoa, that is what I needed to read before I broke down, because I was pushing myself so hard. And we are replaceable. So you just have to make sure you put yourself first rather than pushing yourself to that point. and unfortunately for some of our other colleagues, it's even worse. A lot of junior doctors have taken their own lives, and so I knew it was an important thing to talk about, because it's one of those things that I feel gets brushed under the rug. Yep. It's seen as each individual case is seen as an isolated tragedy, and I think institutions don't really take responsibility for what's happening.
Yeah, and you do notably say that, issues surrounding mental ill health and suicidality didn't really come up as a medical undergraduate. And you also say that, you considered yourself pretty low risk, having no family history of mental illness, having good job, being able to support yourself, family, friends, enjoying exercise.
That's why I think it was such a shock to me. And did you find, Shez, as well, that when you were at med school, no one used to talk about it?
Yeah, so when I was an undergraduate, I do recall that I did my psychiatry term in the IPCU, which is the Intensive Psychiatric Care Unit. And during the time I was there were actually 2 young people who were patients, who were university students. They weren't medical students, but very much like myself, and I did find that very confronting. But again, something probably I didn't dwell on. And then just when you're talking about my intern year, again, there was a job, not the job that I did. One of my good friends did do this surgical intern job that had a very bad reputation. And they had lost an intern to suicide in the previous years. And the solution for the year that my friend did the job was to get an extra intern.
But isn't that terrible that something that tragic has to happen for the medical workforce to do something? And I'm not sure if you're aware of this. In ENT, there was a suicide of an ENT registrar, and as you know, ENT units tend to be quite small compared to the other surgical specialties, so it's quite common for ENT registrars to have done 1 and 2. But after that episode, after that tragedy, they changed it so that now there's a minimum of 3 registrars who share the on-call roster. So it's good that they've now got 3 people doing it, and I think other specialties do need to set that kind of minimum number and protect people who do this kind of 24-hour on-call work. But I just think, how many more suicides and terrible things have to happen until things start to change?
Well, we've talked about statistics on this podcast before. I personally feel we should be robustly measuring, but and I also feel that we shouldn't really be able to hide from statistics, but I think we still try. In terms of one end of occupational syndrome of burnout, we know that the medical profession and our nursing colleagues are at much greater risk. Up to 50% of us might experience burnout at some point in our careers, and more likely to be at risk in that early phase, and particularly in training. And the Beyond Blue survey of physicians from a couple of years ago revealed some very confronting data about our risk of mental health, depression, and suicidality. And we know that females, younger doctors, medical students, international medical graduates are all at much greater risk. And our overall risk is greater than other professions. But, behind statistics, there are people, there are human beings, and I actually think we struggle to engage with data and statistics, but when it comes to human story and when you personalize things, that's when you get engagement and buy-in. And that's why I think your courage in sharing this is so poignant and so important.
And I think we all kind of know statistics, but I think that when a human face is talking, it makes a difference. And I think that's why I really like it, that now we're centering lived experience. I know that it's been kind of, I don't want to use the word trend, but I guess it has been a trend over the last few years to look at lived experience, because we do need to humanize those numbers.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that very nicely demonstrated through this pandemic. You can have numbers of people infected, sick and dying quoted each day, but until you actually have media footage of hospitals, for example, in Italy being utterly overwhelmed, that's when we actually see people engaged and realizing that this is important, this matters, what I do matters, and that this could potentially affect me or the people around about me. So I want to get into the book because I know one of the major themes is highlighting systemic failures and the toxic culture, particularly in medical training. I mean, I couldn't put the book down, and I know many of my colleagues who have said the same. And many of us feel to varying degrees that much of what was written resonates. I mean, you always seek to validate what you see, hear, or read through the window of your own experience. I mean, the book very poignantly highlights some of the toxicity in the ways that we interact with each other, which is so ironic for the apparently caring profession. Talk about the way we depersonalize each other. Hello, is this plastic speaking? A teaching by humiliation is very common in medical training. The title of the book, Emotional Female, comes about because in the middle of the night while working an already unsustainable on-call pattern, somebody calls you and interrupts your sleep for really a non-urgent, non-emergent outpatient appointment. And when, you're understandably upset by that, you're told to stop being an emotional female. And I think severe systemic failures are reflected in that final rotation that you find yourself working with illegal and frankly inhumane hours and on-call requirement, which at senior level everybody has agreed is unacceptable, but nobody really seems willing to do anything constructive to change things. And the pace of the book quickens and becomes very erratic towards the end, and it's a really reflection of your physical and mental state. I was screaming at the pages, here is a brilliant young doctor and she is drowning. And what was most apparent to me is that no one was sending a life raft. I think if we're going to be serious and talk about change, it does start with us. It has to start with us.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people who have left or have gone through this sort of experience of burnt out feel like they were gaslighted by their senior colleagues or the hospital. And so I think that sharing the story and then hearing from other people who have gone through the same thing has been really validating, because it isn't just the individual. And that's what I really wanted to do, to shift the blame from the individual and look at systemic factors, because clearly we have a problem.
And there's evidence to support that. And we've spoken about this on the podcast before. But, I'm obviously a yoga teacher like you, and I love my yoga, but I actually cringe when somebody, says bringing yoga into the equation might be the solution to our problems.
Completely agree. I mean, I love it too, obviously, a big part of my life, but that's not the solution. Or every time I see some resilience workshop, I cringe a bit as well. I mean, of course, those skills are very useful, but it always seems to be putting the emphasis on the individual, and that's, I think, the bit that needs to change.
So you count many of your experiences as a medical student in the book, and I know that you now teach medical undergraduates. I wonder if your experience has shaped or changed the way you interact with your students, or if you have any thoughts on how you would change medical training moving forward.
I'm actually very happy to see that the universities are starting to teach students about stress management and burnout and cultural issues, but that certainly wasn't a part of the curriculum when I went to medical school. So I think it's good that at least the awareness is there and universities are taking an interest in their well-being. And at the uni where I'm at, there's even a well-being group that is run by both the medical society, so the students, as well as members of the deanery as well. So it's really great that there's this collaboration between academics and students to try and address some of the issues about wellness and trying to come up with solutions. So I think that collaborative approach is very encouraging.
What kind of things do they do in that group?
Oh, they talk about different strategies, and they run events and things like that. So they meet fairly regularly to talk about these things and what the uni can do to support students. And I think that was particularly important last year because of COVID and a lot of students feeling isolated. A lot of the teaching was online, or most of it actually, and that posed a huge challenge to some students as well, because it's a style of learning that's completely different. So I think that the uni did try a lot to try and improve the experience for students last year, because it was really hard for everyone.
Yeah, and I'm very conscious in the aftermath of this pandemic, we'll find that the rates of compassion fatigue and moral injury will likely have increased in many of our colleagues. I'm also conscious that many of the attributes and skills that we bring to this job, the ability to be empathetic, to feel with people, it probably places us at greater risk of vicarious trauma and burnout.
And you make a good point there about the empathy, because I heard Professor Gordon Parker talk about burnout recently, and he said that sociopaths don't get burnout. So the fact that a lot of us enter the profession because we want to care for others, a lot of empathetic doctors, that's actually one of the things that makes us vulnerable to burnout, because one of the, I guess, hallmarks of burnout is the loss of empathy. And so you have to have empathy to start with to lose it. So I think that's why I think a lot of doctors burn out, because we care and we are people pleasers.
Yeah, we've said before that this matters so much, because if we are not healthy and sustained and well in ourselves, then we're not able to do our job to the best of our abilities, and that influences the quality of care we can give to our patients. And I do find a discussion around empathy and care, quite ironic, when sometimes I feel that falls short with the way that we interact with one another. Again, I've made reference to that last rotation you were on, but I've got a few quotes from the book here, and somebody coming on and saying, "I am God on this ward." That's your leadership. And when you are struggling and make mention of that, can't you just finish the term? If you can't handle the hours, maybe this isn't for you. You'll never get a job in X again. And then people saying, in my day, this is good for you. Basically, suck it up. And, it's just, this isn't acceptable. Yeah. And, a really good start would be to have safe, sustainable rostering. I really think, this shouldn't be rocket science. I think many people would have unravelled well before you did in that last rotation. We've talked about the sequelae of chronic inappropriate activation of the autonomic nervous system on this podcast before. We are doctors. We should know this stuff. There was no attention to your basic needs. I've also spoken about my wish that we could train our doctors more like athletes. And that would involve prudent attention to rest periods, rest like the best. You need that for maximal adaptation. It's incredulous to me that we can still get this so very wrong. I find it interesting that some of your undergraduate research was on chronic fatigue, particularly in the setting of postglandular fever, because I've talked about, one of my early memories of my workaholic father succumbing to a gastro bug and ending up with a kind of post-viral fatigue. And nobody really, certainly in the medical profession, really knowing what to do with that and how to help him when he found himself physically and mentally exhausted.
I did. So I think I was a second year medical student at the time. I had glandular fever and then I had fatigue after that. And it's interesting that I went through that experience then because I wondered whether it shaped how I felt about depression later on because they're both invisible illnesses. And it is really hard to explain to people when you don't have an obvious physical ailment on the outside. I don't have a big band-aid or a cast or anything, but I just had this kind of pervasive feeling of fatigue all the time and not being able to explain that to others. And so when I found out that one of the academics at the uni was doing a research project on chronic fatigue syndrome, I was really interested in doing that. I think I've always been interested in human psychology, so I thought it was a really interesting interface between biology and psychology to do this project. So I worked with her. She was from the School of Psychiatry, and then my other supervisor was an infectious diseases physician. So we looked particularly at people who got chronic fatigue syndrome following an infection like Ross River virus or Epstein-Barr. And so, the hypothesis was that it was mediated through the autonomic nervous system. So I did some testing in the lab of healthy volunteers and patients, and we did have a positive result at the end. So that was really validating for me because I had science. I could say that there are changes to the autonomic nervous system when you do go through an infection and end up getting fatigue. So I think part of that desperation, I guess, to prove it came from the attitude of other people around me who would judge me or, stigmatize fatigue and depression and all of these illnesses that people just don't seem to understand. And how I felt then as a student definitely was similar to how I felt about depression later on as a doctor, because there is still so much stigma around it. And ironically, among the medical profession, and as you said before, we've all studied psychiatry. We all have cared for people with mental illnesses in the hospital, and yet when it's a colleague, it's different somehow. We are more judgmental. We think that it affects their competence. We think that it's a personality thing, that they're weak somehow. So that was definitely something that was hard for me to grapple with after I myself got diagnosed with depression.
Again, and we've talked about that on the podcast before, there's still pervasive stigma around mental illness and mental ill health in the medical profession. And I wonder if part of that is due to fear, fear that when we see our colleagues unwell or struggling, we realize, if it can happen to him or her, it can happen to me.
Yeah, and as you said before, you always thought that it would never be you. And I felt the same thing. I never thought I would have a mental illness because I had all those protective factors. I just, you learn about all these things that theoretically, I guess, like predisposing factors, precipitating, all of those things in psychiatry theory. And you think, well, theoretically, I should never have a mental illness. So it is very confronting when someone or yourself receives a diagnosis like that. It did rattle me.
And I think a lot of this stems back to what my colleague Bishan would say, our need to rediscover and reacquaint ourselves with the humanity in our profession, the humanity in medicine. Contrary to what your senior colleague might have thought of himself, he's not God. We're not invincible. Like everybody else, we need to eat, we need to sleep, we need, human connection and downtime and rest.
Definitely, but somehow talking about rest seems to be such a dirty word. If you want more sleep, you kind of come across as someone who's lazy, like, oh yeah, that person wants to sleep or have a nap, you know.
My understanding was you actually came up with a few alternatives to the roster that you're working in that last job, to make it, more sustainable for you and still to allow the service to be provided. I think it speaks to the fixer in many of us. That shouldn't actually have been your job to do, but here you were trying to just sort it for everyone.
I just knew that if I didn't do it, nobody else would want to redesign the roster. And I even still offered to do more than the others. So I was still happy to take a heavier load. I just needed a little bit of relief in between so I could recharge. And so I thought I came up with something that was reasonable and fairer, but I just didn't get anywhere. And I think that is what pushed me to leave, because I knew that despite all of these efforts, nothing was going to change. I mean, I had the head of surgery involved even. He was a general surgeon, professor of surgery, in charge of all surgical specialties. And even he couldn't get my unit to change anything. So I thought, well, I'm not going to have any luck if he can't make any changes. So I felt helpless. Yeah.
And that's the point in the book where you finally say, enough is enough. I can't keep doing this. And it's obvious that you're well in the flashing red zone by this point, and you're actually very unwell. But you're surrounded by doctors. And you say that I wanted to sleep, I wanted to go to the gym, and you actually weren't able to do any of those things. And I really feel it should never have come to this. And I'm so sorry that it came to this for you. We spend a lot of time and attention directed towards maintaining autonomy for our patients. Where was your autonomy in this process? There was none. We might talk at the end about the importance of setting boundaries. You weren't able to do that. I remember the first time I said no in my medical career, which wasn't something that was done. It was frowned upon. And I was very stressed at the time. But I've said no many times since. And the good thing is that it does get easier. Undoubtedly, it's easier on the other side of specialist training. You have this great phrase in the book where you say, when you study medicine, you become a doctor. There is no deviation from the factory line. And I think that is to an extent very true, particularly on a specialist training program, whereas there's just this expectation that you'll jump through all of these hoops, and then, it only continues on the other side of a fellowship exam. I remember having a conversation with one of my consultants when I was in that advanced trainee phase, and we talked about the various things that I would need to do, and we started to talk already about preparing for the consultant job, and this was before I'd even contemplated starting to prepare for the exam itself, and I remember thinking to myself, no, that's not what I want to do. And I actually said, well, look, I actually, on the other side of this exam, I actually want to take some time out. There are some other, areas of medicine, some other areas outside medicine that I really want to discover, because I've not had any autonomy to do that through this training program. And I remember being quite clearly told that that was ill-advised. I think today, fortunately, we have great groups like Creative Careers in Medicine, and, many people are testament to the fact that that is not the case. But I suspect in surgical training and other specialist training pathways, it still is pretty much the norm. I think the other interesting thing is identity. I have taken some periods then outside medicine where I did very little clinical work and did other things. And, I think it's really interesting to ask the question, who am I if I'm not a doctor?
Yeah, I grappled with the same thing as well. I think I did have somewhat of an identity crisis, because like you were saying before, we answer with the specialty, say, hello, this is plastics, or hello this, hello that. And you get called that, and no one ever calls you by name. So you kind of lose your sense of self to your work. And so it is hard to walk away, because it's so frowned upon. Somehow if you leave it, you feel like there's this big obstacle to try and get back in again. So it's never really encouraged. So it is hard to take that break. Even people taking gap years or, years off to travel or locum or do whatever that they need to do outside of medicine, it's frowned upon because it's seen as taking time away from what you should be dedicating your every hour to. So
Yeah, and I think I've said before that my own experience of going off piste, if you like, both exploring alternative pathways, both within medicine and outside, has been professionally and personally fulfilling. And I'd like to think it adds to my commitment, and it's certainly reinvigorated my emergency medicine practice, and I'd encourage it. But it's interesting. I have a very good friend and colleague who's a specialist overseas, and I think she's done some very cool things through her training, and also she's made some life choices that are not mainstream that I'm in awe of. Yet I was really surprised and quite taken aback a couple of years ago when she referred to me as a free spirit. And, that's not a label I really identify with for myself. I really think I'm very conservative. And, she's not the only one who has said that in recent years. And these are all colleagues, I've been called a gypsy or free-spirited.
yeah, no, it's interesting you said that because I've been called a free spirit by lots of people too, because we've gone rogue, Shez. Yeah.
I know that you're a runner like me. I can't wait to take you off-road trail running, and we'll go and be free-spirited together.
I've only done one trail, but it was just spectacular. Just the freedom that you feel. Same when I go ocean swimming. It's so liberating and it's so beautiful. And every time I actually do something like that, or the first time I went scuba diving, I thought, wow, the world is so beautiful. And you never actually stop to appreciate nature or other things that the world has to offer because you're stuck in the four grey walls of a hospital all the time. And sometimes, I guess, not even windows, depending on what area you're working in. So sometimes it takes coming out of something to appreciate all the other things.
But I mean, you are an artist, you're a surgeon, and you're a plastic surgeon. There's creativity and art in that.
I think that's what drew me to plastics, because I guess it's such a creative part of surgery. So I always had that, like you said before, the left brain, right brain thing. It appealed to both sides of my brain.
And I think that comes across really well in the book, because you do describe your early life, and it's quite apparent that you have all of these other talents and interests, wide ranging in art, in sport, in music.
Yeah, I didn't write too much about my childhood. It was only, through the editing process where the editor said, we'd like to get you to write a bit more about what you were like as a child. Because I think a lot of things do carry on from childhood. I think those early experiences are very important in your development. And I definitely was a creative kid. I went to ballet classes. I liked music. I liked drawing, all of those things. So, maybe I was always meant to do something more creative.
Yeah. I'd love you to tell us about the process of writing and the creative process. I can only imagine that it was very intense to revisit your own story at times. But I heard you say that, it was cathartic and almost therapeutic in many respects.
Yeah, it was interesting because I guess I had done a lot of medical writing, so I had to undo a lot of my habits, because when we write journal articles or any sort of medical writing, you have to be very concise and get to the point. So I had to undo all of that. I kept getting told, want you to drip feed a bit more. Can you describe that a bit more? So I definitely had to change the way I wrote. And for me, I'm such a nerd. I like learning anything, whether it's medicine or writing. I really enjoyed working with the editors because they taught me a lot about the process of writing. And like you were saying before, the pace changes towards the end of the book when things got more stressful. And that's something that I wasn't conscious about initially, but I guess working with an editor, we thought about kind of the arc of the storyline and where to peak. And so I had to make sure that the peaking was right towards the end, that was where it had to be the most intense. So as well as it being a very personal experience, it was also kind of a intellectual experience as well, writing a book, because it's unlike anything I've done before. I mean, I certainly haven't written anything of this length before. I think my preference has always been to write shorter articles and things. So it was a huge learning curve to write something of that length. But it was I guess the technical part of it was enjoyable, learning all those new skills. But like you said, it was also quite distressing at times as well, going back and thinking about things that I hadn't thought about for a long time, even things like, I was sexually assaulted as a medical student, and that's something that I kept to myself for a really long time. I hadn't even told any friends or any family members about it. So that was something new that my friends read and said, oh, we had no idea that that happened to you when you were 19. So that was quite difficult because I'd buried that memory. But I knew that it was something important to write about, because I don't want other girls to go through that same thing. Or men. I guess it happens to some men as well, but a lot of young women in medicine do experience it and no one reports it. But I guess now, especially in parallel with what's happening in Parliament, I feel that women are starting to feel a bit more empowered to speak up about these kind of misogynistic behaviors. And I just wish that, even within the medical profession, we are reporting these things and making sure that we're protecting our younger peers. And now that I've worked at the university, I see these young medical students. They're so young. Some of them are still teenagers. I was still a teenager at the time, and I want to protect them. So, so writing about that was really difficult, but I knew that everything I wrote about had to have some sort of impact and importance, and that's why I chose to share so much of myself that I haven't shared before.
Yeah, and like many of the really important themes visited in this book, I'm actually glad that there was this opportune time of release of the book to harness the momentum to highlight this, not just for women in medicine, but it does give you that kind of wider voice. And I think we've seen doctors speak up in many domains past 12 months.
And even there were the two doctors who did the petition for the Women's March for Justice in Canberra. That was wonderful to see the medical profession say, that they're part of the doctors group against violence towards women. So it's so great to have some medical voices say, we don't condone this behavior, and we want to support women who have gone through this as well. So I think that it's funny because I don't know how you feel about this, Shez, but I feel like as doctors, we're discouraged from getting involved in politics. But politics is medicine. A lot of these things like racism isn't a medical problem. You see the impacts of this when I guess, social health or the social determinants of health are seen as soft areas of medicine. Somehow we have to focus more on the physical things, the physiological conditions. But I think that it is good for doctors to be vocal about these social issues because they affect people and it affects people's health. So I'm really glad that doctors are feeling more comfortable discussing what's happening in the political sphere and in the social sphere as well.
Yeah, and I have a beautiful conversation with one of my colleagues and past president of our college, Dr. Simon Judkins, in season 1 of the podcast, where we talk about his work. And he talks about this spectrum between advocacy and activism. And, as emergency doctors, we are very important advocates for our patients and our communities by the very nature of the work that we do. And I think that voice that we are for them, it very easily extends to a wider scale and should do. We are very well placed to be that voice.
Yeah, I guess especially for you in the emergency department, you're the front line. So if a woman were to be sexually assaulted or raped and needs to be examined, I guess like, and all junior doctors rotate through emergencies. So I guess it's important to know how to handle those situations in a very sensitive and caring way, because it does impact women for long after that first emergency admission, I guess. I mean, we saw, Kate Thornton in the news. She committed suicide last year. So we see that sexual assault has long lasting impacts on people's mental health. So I think it's so important for medical professionals to be watching the news, being politically active, and being advocates for women and other marginalized groups.
So our college have recently appointed some well-being champions, of which I'm one, and I'm aware I've taken on a portfolio of well-being for my department and organisation. And it's something we're nutting out at the moment. What actually is well-being? How do we define it? And I'd love to know, for you personally, what is your own working definition of well-being? What does it mean to you?
That's such a big question. For me, it's about living a life that aligns with my values. And I think that ties in as well to the discussions about, burnout versus using the word moral injury. It's about doing things that you believe in as well, and making sure that everything that you do aligns with what you believe in and what your values are. So for me, that's part of well-being. And it's about, I mean, the whole mind body spirit thing is a common I guess paradigm to look at well-being, and I definitely follow that. I think having a healthy mind and a healthy body is part of well-being, but also bringing in that kind of more personal element of knowing what your values and your priorities are, I think definitely helps me focus on the way I continually try to keep well.
Yeah, beautiful. I think that's really important what you've just said, and I want to use that as an opportunity to segue into a conversation that we said we would have about yoga. I was attending the Monash Women's Leadership course a few weeks ago. It was something that had been recommended to me by a few colleagues, and as part of that 3-day course, there was quite a lot of opportunity for self-reflection. For considering things like values and purpose and, setting mission statements, and a lot of time for this kind of introspection. And there was quite a few senior physicians on that course. And, many of them did make note of the fact that this was probably one of the first times in their careers that they'd done exercises like this. And I would agree, I haven't really done that through my professional career in medicine, but what I did, a lot of it was familiar because in my yoga teacher training, and particularly in, the philosophy lectures and sessions, I had quite a lot of time to, visit many of these themes and questions, and ask questions, to be honest, about myself and about the world that, it hadn't even really occurred to me to ask before, which I thought was quite interesting. And, recently on the Creative Careers in Medicine group, there is actually quite a number of us who have undertaken yoga teacher training. And, I remarked on this, and I wonder if part of that opportunity, is the attraction. So I'm really curious because I know that you, and you speak about it in the book, have had an immersive yoga teacher training experience. And I just wonder what came up for you in that respect, and has it influenced, your values?
Oh, definitely. Of course, I love the physical practice of it. It feels good afterwards physically, but the thing that helped me the most was definitely the philosophy. It really changed the way I thought about things and the way that I lead my life and the thing. And I think it's also what's helped me set my boundaries now as well, because now I have a clearer idea of what's important and what's not important for me. And it it is hard because modern society is so consumerist as well. So that concept of aparigraha, detaching from external things, is really hard. And especially now, like writing a book as well, it's a physical product that has to be sold in shops. So to separate that is very difficult right now, because it's when you're living and breathing it every day, it is hard to separate. But yeah, it's interesting what you said about the women at that conference, because I think that when you're working so much, you don't get time to think about yourself, especially in a service job. When you're there looking after other people, you don't kind of look after yourself. Um, but definitely the philosophy exercises were so useful. We went through all the yamas and the niyamas and thought about examples in everyday life as well as on the mat. And you never really get that opportunity to do that. I mean, a lot of people, do the yoga teacher training part-time on the weekends and things, but to be fully immersed in it, that's all I did all day, every day for a month. That forced me to think a lot about not just life, but also why I do yoga as well. I think I had the wrong idea of yoga. I initially did it because I guess the competitive part of me liked it, that I was good at it because I was naturally flexible, and I completely missed the point. I had no idea about the origins of yoga, but I think studying the philosophy and the meaning of yoga helped me connect, I guess, the spiritual side of the practice.
And so what does your yoga practice look like now, and what does yoga mean to you?
Well, right now I don't have a huge amount of time doing the physical practice, but I think about it in terms of just everyday things, things that I'm grateful for. And even things like just allowing things to happen, trusting in the universe, those sort of ideas do pop up now and then. And even just remembering to breathe as well.
Yeah, and that's yoga. All of what you've just described there is yoga. One of my favorite teachers says, the yoga begins when you step off the mat. And I'm aware that I start my day with the best of sankalpa and intentions, but it can quickly deteriorate. Just as well, it's yoga practice, not yoga perfect.
Oh, me too. It has to be like a conscious reminder every day to follow it. But even things like, what does it mean to be content? Those kind of thoughts, I think about those things a lot. And well, at the moment, I do some surgical assisting, and I am very content with that. And I think that I definitely had to put my ego in check when I left, because I guess when you embark on a career and you think you're going to be something, I thought I was going to be a surgeon. It took a lot for me to kind of accept that I wasn't going to do that anymore, and be okay with being somebody else's assistant. And I've always loved leadership positions, and I've always been a type A personality. So for me to actually say, what, I'm okay with being somebody's number two, I'm okay with being second fiddle, is something that took a lot of shifting in how I thought about myself and my ego. And so now I'm okay with it. I don't need to be a surgeon, I mean, and
You are still the surgeon. You are a surgeon.
I'm still operating.
And you're working as part of a team for your patients.
And I feel valued within the team. It's nice. I mean, obviously when I started medical school, I imagined that I would be working in a big public hospital in surgery, but things don't always turn out the way you expect them to, and that's okay. And now I guess I am grateful that I'm able to go back to clinical work, because I do enjoy it. I do enjoy operating and being in the theatres, and working in private now means that I follow the same two surgeons everywhere they go, and they have the same nurses every week. So it's just like having that work family. And that, for me, I think that's one of the values that I reflected on while I was doing the yoga teacher training. What do I value? And for me, personal relationships are important, whether it's family or friends. And I want to lead a life where I enjoy the interactions I have with other people. And so doing what I do now allows me to work with people that I like, and people who make me feel valued as well. So that's my santosha.
Yeah. I mean, I saw the picture of you just out of theatre with that glow, and it was a glow of Santosha. Yeah, and I've seen that same glow of Santosha in you this past few weeks, with images of you sitting in Dymocks and other booksellers at book launches and other literary events. I'm also very conscious, though, that, it's taken a lot of hard work and time to get to this state where you are able to be content. I think I feel so lucky we're having this conversation on the other side of this. And I know it is a work in progress, always. But, we've talked about the need for systemic and cultural change. And I personally feel it starts with every one of us. And I think everyone needs to listen to your story and to read the book. And, we need to be having open and frank conversations. I'd love to hear your perspective on how we proceed.
I think you made a good point about things taking time to change. I guess culture is something that's so hard to measure. But those little things make a big difference. And it's something that what I always did every Monday was make sure I asked every member of the team how their weekend was, whether it's medical student or resident or the nurse in charge on the ward. I always ask how that person is doing. And at the end of the day, every single day, I always said, thanks for your hard work today, every day. And I think that's something I picked up from registrar when I was doing neurosurgery term. There was a reg every single day without fail. She'll say, thanks for your hard work today. Even if I felt like I didn't do anything that day, her saying that made a huge difference. It made me feel good about being part of the team. And I think that, you can modify it so that it's authentic and sounds natural coming out of your own mouth, but I think that there are kind things that you can say to people every day that make them feel good about being at work. And you never know what's going on with people at home. I always say check on your strong friends, because a lot of people are good at putting up a facade, especially at work when we're pressured to present in a very professional way, but saying something nice every day to somebody, I think, does make a difference and does contribute to that overall culture. I guess in the short term, easy things to do for institutions would be to make sure that there's enough workers, the workforce numbers, and setting a limit to the number of hours and the consecutive on-call. I think the on-call has been a huge problem for surgical people because it's invisible work. It's easier to look at the shifts, what time you clock on and clock off, but a lot of people don't consider on-call work as proper work, even though that's the one that I found to be the most mentally taxing because you can't switch off. So I think setting limits to how much consecutive on-call someone should be doing is really important. So those are concrete things that can be put in place straight away. But the cultural things, those are the things that are going to take a lot longer to change, and we won't know for a little while because it's so hard to measure.
Yeah, it's my own feeling that we actually should be measuring. I think we have to be very transparent, and I think we have to get very clear on our definitions about what workplace well-being looks like. If we're going to make well-being a key agenda at college and executive level in major institutions, then we need that objectivity and clarity. There are validated tools in existence, and if we can use those to assess the effectiveness of any interventions we might put in place. This is being done in other parts of the world. I think that I still find it quite mind-boggling we can't get the basics like safe, sustainable rostering correct.
And I think I read a really great BMJ article recently about the survivorship bias. And I think that it affects medicine a lot because we only look at the people who have stayed and don't really examine why we're driving people out. And so I guess there's this perception among, senior physicians and surgeons who say, well, I got through it all right, so why can't these people do it? So I think that's partly why there's some resistance to changing some of the rostering and things that have been in place for a very long time.
Is there any key message from the book that we maybe haven't discussed today that you want to send to this audience in particular?
Oh, I think I probably already said it before, in that the more we're able to share our experiences, the more we can validate each other's experiences, and make you feel less alone. Because I think when you burn out, you feel like it's your fault and somehow it's you failed. But I think that it's such a common experience, and I think part of it is, especially in male dominated specialties, there's so much toxic masculinity that it's not, cool to talk about your vulnerabilities. But I think that the more we can acknowledge how human we are, the more it's going to help each other kind of get through day by day.
Yeah, so powerful. Thank you. I don't know if you listened to my episode with Hugh last week, but that was exactly what he spoke to, and the central themes of strength and vulnerability, and our need to collaborate. We're very lucky to have you and your voice. Thank you so much for your time. I would actually love to spend another hour and be sitting in person with a cup of coffee having this conversation with you, because I think there is so much more that we could say. But I know that you don't have all day. I wanted to finish on a couple of the final questions that I like to ask our guests. And just firstly, we're building a Mindful Medic podcast book list. And now you're one of our many doctor authors that's been featured. I'd love to know what you have recently or are currently reading that you'd like to add to the list.
I am reading, or I've just read, Rick Morton's book, A Year of Living Vulnerably. And I think that's a perfect segue from what I was just talking before about toxic masculinity, because he challenges the ideas about masculinity. And he talks about his experience with complex PTSD, but he weaves it in with a lot of psychology, philosophy, neurology, all these different interesting themes woven together really beautifully. So it's really wonderful to see a man write so vulnerably about his experience. I guess there's this idea that women are emotional and women are the ones who are able to talk about these things, but I think it'll be really great if more men feel comfortable to talk about mental health and what it means to be masculine.
Perfect. I talked about well-being, but I noticed that we'll maybe talk about the 4 things that you're working on.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a working definition of good health for yourself? What does good health mean to you?
Yeah, I always go back to the mind, body, spirit thing. So to make sure that, I'm always thinking positively, I'm surrounding myself with people who uplift me. And the body thing is just so simple, just the basic bodily functions, making sure I'm drinking enough water, making sure that I am sleeping, eating well, all of those basic things, because even the basics I still neglect sometimes, even now. So I just constantly have to stick to basics, and I'm trying to keep it simple so that I don't forget.
Because you spoke about 1, boundaries, 2, sleep, 3, exercise, 4, mindfulness. And
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I preach this all the time, but I agree it is difficult sometimes to practice.
Yeah, I have to remind myself all the time because I always veer off.
What any strategies that you plan to help you with those 4 domains?
You know what? The most important one, I think, is boundaries, because without boundaries, you can't address any of the other ones. So, and it's still hard for me because I always want to say yes to everything. But learning to say no has been one of the biggest lessons for me in the last couple of years. So making sure that if it's something I don't want to do, not to feel bad about saying no, it's okay.
Yeah. And we have got a holiday Sunday coming up for you. Can you describe what your ideal self-care Sunday would look like?
Oh my! I love my brunch, so brunch always has to be that, and I consider that a mindful activity because it's, I'm mindful of my taste buds and all the different flavors on the plate, and so I do like having a leisurely brunch, even by myself. It doesn't even have to be with friends. I often like going out to eat on my own just to treat
Right.
myself to something nice. This Sunday I'm actually covering a body pump class, and I guess it's something we didn't talk about today, but I'll just quickly mention that through my recovery, I've had a psychiatrist, and she talks about exercise being an important part of healing. It's not, in the Western paradigm, we often think about medications, but an important part of mental health is exercise. And I believe the current guidelines are three sessions of resistance exercise a week. So I have to prioritize that, and that's partly why I decided to start teaching body pump, because it forces me to do that resistance exercise that's been prescribed to me. So
I think it says a lot about you, Yumiko, that you actually went the full hog to become a fully qualified body pump instructor to incorporate your resistance work into your week.
I'm nerdy. I had to make sure I get those 3 sessions in, and if I have to teach it, then that keeps me accountable. I have to turn up every week to teach my class, and that's how I get my resistance session in. So that's part of my self-care. This Sunday I'm gonna teach body pump, go for a nice brunch, and then have a quiet afternoon, I think.
Yeah, so utterly deserved. I really hope you take time to enjoy and celebrate your many achievements. And just on that, the final question. I mean, I know that you've had a really hectic couple of weeks and have been in some very new and no doubt challenging situations with all your book launches and media appearances. What do you have in your toolbox? Any go-to strategies, tips or tricks for when you are challenged or you're struggling?
I work with a psychologist, and it's something that I've had to prioritize. I haven't needed really to see her for several months, which is a good thing, but I think that it's so important to incorporate therapy into everyday life, even if you're feeling fine, because having that check-in with somebody else is so useful. And she gives me a lot of strategies to prepare for potential stresses, and when I do get those kind of distressing feelings, there is a type of therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy, and that's the one that's been particularly helpful for me. There are 4 domains in that type of therapy, and one of them is distress tolerance. So every time I feel stressed or feel anxious or I have this unpleasant feelings, she has a few different strategies for me to relieve that. And one that I've particularly warmed to is actually sucking on an ice cube. There's evidence that lowering your body temperature is a good way of relieving acute distress. So every time I'm feeling stressed, I think in the past I would have I'm an emotional eater, so whenever, or a lot of people stress eat. I was definitely one of those people, and but now if I'm feeling that way, I suck on an ice cube. So that's a random tip.
Perfect. I love it. I was just thinking, at the end of the book, when you start your new job in the university, and that your supervisor or boss that day, she gives you a nice card. I don't know if it was a cake, and she just said, welcome. We're going to rebuild your career, and I think this week's going to be tough for you. So I just wanted to check in with you. I actually thought that was powerful as well.
Yeah,
And
that was beautiful. I was so touched. I wasn't expecting that at all, that she would even be, she's got so many things going on. I didn't think that she knew that that was my first day even. And she knew that was going to be my first day, and it would be hard for me because it's not what I initially intended on doing with my life and my career. So for someone to reach out like that was really nice.
But it just made me think, well, what if we all did that for each other every day? What if that was the standard? I mean, I really,
Yeah.
should be. And I'm delighted we're having this conversation with you on the other side of this. And
you're in a great space, and I'm so excited to see what Miko did next.
Thank
I
you.
think there will be so many more chapters.
And I can't wait to bear witness to them. I'm also looking forward to taking you for a trail run here in beautiful Tassie when you make it down. Enjoy that Sunday brunch.
Thank you. It was so good to chat to you.
You have been listening to Dr. Yumiko Kadota. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I did feel that had we had more time and opportunity to have this conversation in person, we would have gone deeper into some of the other important themes that are discussed in Emotional Female. I'll put a link to the book, to Miko's blog, and to her social media handle in the show notes. Again, if anything we have discussed in this episode affects either you or someone close to you, can I encourage you to access some of the great resources we have discussed through this podcast, and I will link them all again in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to joining you next time.
And I think we all kind of know statistics, but I think that when a human face is talking, it makes a difference. And I think that's why I really like it, that now we're centering lived experience. I know that it's been kind of, I don't want to use the word trend, but I guess it has been a trend over the last few years to look at lived experience, because we do need to humanize those numbers.
The MBA New South Wales ACT does wonderful work for those of our colleagues who are, at this very minute, experiencing a hard time. One way you can show you care about doctors' welfare is to go to their website, www.mbansw.org.au, and donate today. Knowing that their colleagues' care is a big part of these doctors' recovery, so please be part of the solution. All donations are tax deductible. If you can, please consider a monthly donation, as even small amounts collectively will allow them to plan their growth to support the increased demand.